Good evening, I am Tomas Guevara, and this is the channel Rewriting the Reality. If you want to be well informed about how you create your reality, please subscribe to this channel now. 3 days ago, I received an email with the following transcription of a podcast aired on July 21st by Chakrabarty, who was interviewing Dr. Newberg about spirituality. Deb McGuire has one experience at the Bay Bridge where she had that moment of clarity that she felt as if she belonged in California. And, just like that, Deb had found a home. When she returned to Texas, she said she never bothered to even quit grad school formally and instead packed her bags and took a moving truck and returned to her new home in California. Now, more than 45 years later, Deb says that experience on the Bay Bridge changed her life at the time. She didn't know what her future could look like. Now here is the transcript. Chakrabarty, alright, so that's on point, listener Deb McGuire, sharing her experience from 1977. Now, Dr. Newberg, before we get into a discussion about what we should do with the knowledge that you're uncovering about spirituality and the brain, there's just a couple of other scientific things I want to quickly go over with you. One of them is, everyone who responded to our call for their stories, our listeners, did what we asked if they'd ever had a spiritual experience. So, the stories were overwhelmingly ones of spontaneous spiritual experiences, as you've heard. Which is a different thing than people who are engaged in spiritual practice that you've done the imaging studies on. So, can we say that the things happening in the brain during a concentrated, self-generated spiritual practice are the same things that are happening in the brain during these spontaneous experiences? Newberg, I think we can certainly extrapolate to that kind of a conclusion. The reason that we study practices like meditation and prayer is that it's just easier. Somebody can come in, we can say, okay, start your practice now. 45 minutes in, we know that they typically have an experience of unity or oneness. So, there's a predictability to it, which certainly, from a scientific perspective, makes it a lot easier. The spontaneous experiences, which are very important and a very important part of what I have been looking at, you can't do a brain scan of them because you never know when they're going to happen. But when we hear what people talk about, and this last story, wow, it just includes so many of the elements that we've been talking about. That sense of connectedness, that sense of clarity, that sense of transformation, the intensity of the experience, all these things are common across all of them. And I think maybe even a more important point, that to me is a very important aspect of the neurotheology work that we do, is that, to me, it's a big puzzle that we have all these pieces to. So, there are spontaneous experiences. And then, there's near-death experiences, and a couple of people talked about things happening around death. There is these dark night of the soul experiences. She mentioned a little bit of that she was really at a very low point when the experience happened. And there are times when people have them during practices like meditation and prayer. There are the effects of psychedelic experiences. Chakrabarty, aha. Newberg, so, all of these they all help us to get what these experiences are like in different ways. But when you actually get the descriptions of them, you keep at least, feel like, we keep coming back to these same basic components that make me think that there's probably a lot of similarities going on in the brain, even though they may originate from different reasons or different sources. Chakrabarty, correct. So, the fact that we keep coming back to these same basic components, regardless of what name we want to ascribe to the experience, whether it be God, whether it be feeling at one with nature, whatnot. It makes me wonder if really what we're experiencing is something even more fundamental. And here I'm just going to bow to the work of Dr. Anna McKinn, I believe is how you pronounce her name? Or McKinn. From the UK, who did scans of Carmelite nuns who were meditating on God. And she found that what they feel for God is akin to love, the love we have for our fellow humans. And so, her conclusion is that when we talk about the inordinate impact of spiritual experiences, what we're really seeing in the brain is what she calls the neural fingerprint of love. Newberg, okay. Chakrabarty, what do you think about that? Newberg, I think love is a very important part of a lot of these experiences. I would say though that, when we started to look at our group of about 2,000 experiences, that not all of them talked about it in that kind of term. And I think a very important question that ultimately comes out from all of this is that when people say, I felt love, I felt power, I felt oneness, I felt connectedness, I felt an energy, I felt a force. So, we see all these different terms used. It's not always clear to me whether they all have the exact same experience that are just described in different ways because people think about them differently, or if they are really fundamentally different kinds of experiences. And my leaning is a little bit to the fact that there may be differences, but ultimately, it's the intensity of those experiences, whether it winds up being love, whether it winds up being a sense of awe, a sense of fear sometimes is part of that, a sense of connectedness, but it's the intensity of those experiences. So, I think that certainly love is a fundamental part of many of these experiences. I don't know if it's part of all of them. And maybe one last little point to make in that regard is that while about 95% of these experiences are overwhelmingly positive, there is a percentage, a very small percentage, that are negative, but still are considered to be spiritual. And so, this is another whole area for us to begin to look at, which is what happens when these experiences don't go quite so well and lead people to real struggle and anger, fear, and so forth, because of these experiences. So, there's a lot for us to look at and to dissect as far as what all of these experiences are about. Chakrabarty, oh, sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be talking about this. Newberg, absolutely. Chakrabarty, or you wouldn't be dedicating your life's work to it. But so, I have to say, my soul is definitely inclined towards the sort of complex interpretation of experiences as being otherworldly or supernatural or beyond comprehensibility. But as the rational part of my brain reads the research that's been done on this, I also find that there's some overlap between what happens when we have these spiritual experiences and what happens in the brain when people are having sex or doing drugs. Not to bring Karl Marx into this, but is this also just another version of the opiate of the masses, and that's what we're seeing in these neural studies? Newberg, well, that's a great question. We've actually done some research where we've looked at, not just the areas of the brain that are turned on or turned off, but the neurotransmitters, which is what you're talking about. And actually, I used to quip that there was one study that showed that it actually isn't really the opiate system of the brain that's involved. So, I think Marx probably was wrong. But on the other hand, there are other chemicals, natural chemicals like serotonin and dopamine, which are probably very involved in these experiences. We did a study of people going through a spiritual retreat that showed that the brain became more sensitive to the effects of these neurotransmitters. And when I was talking a few moments ago about different ways in which people have these experiences, the psychedelic drugs, for example, like psilocybin or LSD, they particularly very strongly affect, for example, the serotonin system. And so, is it possible that these kinds of swirling neurotransmitters around in our brain really help us to have these kinds of experiences? And I think that's a very important way for us to begin to look at exactly what's going on. But the last thing, to your point about what's the real nature of these experiences? The analogy that I frequently use is that I wear glasses and, I know the listeners can't see that, but I wear glasses. So, when I wake up in the morning, it's a very blurry world. And I put my glasses on, and I see the world clearly. So, who's to say that if a shaman takes some kind of magic mushroom and has an experience, is that the same thing, like putting glasses on the brain, that they now just see the world differently, not necessarily artificially? And of course, that's the big, $100,000 question, what's really going on? Chakrabarti, yeah. Newberg, but people need to understand that just because we can look at all the different things that are going on in the brain, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily explain them away. Maybe we can someday, but until we really are certain about that, we have to be open to the possibility that there are other explanations that still could all make sense in the context of how our brain is ultimately responding to whatever's going on around us. Chakrabarti, so, I heard you say earlier that outside the realm of pure research, that one of the important things that you would hope coming out of your work is that by understanding what's happening in the brain when we have these spiritual experiences, it should help us understand, or feel more sympathetic towards, people with different beliefs. But on the other hand, you also said earlier that having those distinct beliefs or ways of seeing of the world, it's fundamental to aiding us in our survival, which is why we cling on to the beliefs as tenaciously as we do. So those two things are in opposition. And I was wondering if you could very briefly tell us a story of something that you experienced in 2010 when you'd given a talk or something and you got 2 calls, one from a nun and one from an atheist. Newberg, right. Chakrabarti, and they had essentially told you exactly the same thing. Go ahead. Newberg, it speaks about the point that we were just discussing. So yes. That came about with our study of the Catholic nuns as we were talking about earlier. And when I did the brain scan of the nun, and I showed her the scan, she thanked me. She said, "Oh, this is terrific. It really helps to support the idea that when I do this prayer, it's not just something spiritual, but it's changing my biology. It's changing my brain. And it really reinforces my whole belief in God." She said, "Thank you so much for doing this research." I said, "You're welcome." I felt very good that I had made this nun so happy. A nice Jewish boy making a nun happy seemed to be a good thing. Newberg, and then, after we published the data, I got a call and our assistant said, "There's the head of the local atheist society who wants to talk to you." Okay. And I got on the phone, and he said, "Dr. Newberg, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing this research and proving that religion and spirituality is nothing more than just the manifestation of our brain's functions. And that there is no God, and it's just neurobiology." And I said, "You're welcome." And I suppose there was some cosmic balance that the same information made a nun who's deeply religious and an atheist who's deeply non-religious both happy. But it speaks to the larger point, which is, how do we ultimately interpret this information? And I think we have to be careful about that. And I try to be at my own work. I think it's fascinating to be able to learn what's going on in the brain and to see what's happening and to help us understand how we as human beings engage in what arguably is one of the most important parts of humanity. Religion and spirituality have basically been there since the beginning of civilization and even before. So, shouldn't we try to understand that? But it also helps us to add to these big philosophical and theological questions, because before, it was just arguments. And now we have some data to bring into the discussion about what people experience and what's going on in the brain. So, there's a lot for us to continue to explore. And that to me is what's so exciting about it. Chakrabarti, Dr. Andrew Newberg. He's research director of the Marcus Institute for Integrative Health and a professor at Thomas Jefferson University. One of the pioneers of neurotheology, as we've been talking about. The author of many books on the topic, the latest of which is The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, 21st Century Research and Perspectives, and of neurotheology, how science can enlighten us about spirituality. Dr. Newberg, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much. Newberg, thanks for having me on the program. This program was aired on July 21, 2023. Here is my opinion. If you pay attention to this transcript, you will agree with me that everything is about beliefs. The first belief is about the brain. Most people believe that we use the brain to think, and this is not literally true. I have explained that the brain is a tool to analyze what we create. Also, that the mind doesn't reside in the brain, nor doesn't the consciousness. When you are meditating or praying, you are more open to receive information from yourself, because you are in essence. This is the case of the nun praying. She was talking to her essence. Essence has many focuses in this world. I explained that I have 784 focuses. You can have less or more, there is no rule about that, except for the minimum 3 focuses to experience the orientation. Our beliefs affect the analysis that the brain does and of course affect our perceptions mechanism, that is the tool we use to create all our reality. Religion is an element of our reality, our sexuality is another element, and we have created a lot of beliefs around both elements. When you are open to receiving information from your essence, your brain enters in this play and uses the beliefs you strongly hold. This affects your experience. When you use drugs or are given drugs, the drugs diminish the force of your beliefs, and you can have a more fulfilling experience. Do you need to use drugs? Definitively no. You only need to accept that your beliefs are only that, beliefs. They are not truths. Now you must understand that spirituality is not the same as religion, they are two different things. Right now, you are the highest representation of your spirituality, but you don't believe it yet. To understand more about your nature, you must watch my first 6 episodes. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel.